It is a March morning in Boston in 1770. The town is tense and abuzz with talk. The night before, a massacre had occurred near the Custom House. 5 Bostonians were killed, shot by British soldiers. On this morning, a merchant named James Forrest visits the office of a 34-year-old Boston attorney. Forrest has tears streaming from his eyes. He asks the attorney if he would defend the British soldiers and their captain, Thomas Preston. The young lawyer understands the consequence of taking the case. He will be subject to criticism. His involvement will jeopardize his legal practice. It even risks the safety of himself and his family. But he believes deeply that every person deserves a defense, and he agrees to take the case. For his effort, he will receive the modest sum of 18 guineas. The young attorney is John Adams, future drafter of the Declaration of Independence and the second President of the United States. He will pay a price for his decision to represent the British soldiers and their captain, but it is a decision that he is proud of for the rest of his life. In the snowy winter of 1770, many residents of Boston had a gripe. They were deeply resentful of the presence of the British military in their city. Regiments of regulars had been quartered in Boston for nearly a year and a half. 7 soldiers hurried out, some without even putting on their coats. Preston and the other man, in columns of 2, moved across King Street with the muskets and fixed bayonets. They pushed on through the crowd of 50 to 100 civilians near the custom house. And finally, they reached the beleaguered sentry. Preston ordered White to fall into line and to start to march back to the main guard. But the mob blocked them. Hemmed in, the soldiers lined up in a semicircle facing the crowd. Many in the crowd threw missiles of various sorts. The soldiers were facing flying chunks of coal, snowballs, and oyster shells. And here the accounts begin to vary. But the most likely story is this. Captain Preston shouts for the crowd to disperse, but it continues to press in. A large mixed-race man named Crispus Attucks steps forward, wielding a club. Attucks grabs the soldier's bayonet and knocks him to the ground. The soldier, named Hugh Montgomery, rises and shouts, "Damn you, fire!" In spurts, not in volleys, soldiers fire 6 leaden balls into the crowd. The shots kill 4 men, including Crispus Attucks. Another victim would die 10 days later from his injuries. Then a blast from the gun of soldier Matthew Kilroy hits Samuel Gray as he stands with his hands in his pockets. The blast blows a hole in Gray's head as big as a hand. A 17-year-old apprentice to an ivory turner, as well as a sailor, are also hit in the chest, and both die from their injuries. Another half-dozen civilians lie seriously injured along King Street. As several soldiers load their weapons and prepare to fire again, Captain Preston yells, "Stop firing! Do not fire!" The Boston Massacre is over. It's been almost 2.5 centuries since that moonlit March night in 1770, and people still debate responsibility for the Boston Massacre. Does the blame rest with the crowd of Bostonians who hurled the insults, the snowballs, the oyster shells, and the other objects at the soldiers? Or does the blame rest with the British soldiers for violating laws of the colony that prohibited firing at civilians? These were the questions also addressed in the Boston courtroom. And the British captain and his soldiers had on their side to tell their story one of the most important people in American history. When word of the shootings reached acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, he rushed to King Street. There he found an angry crowd and a shaken Captain Preston. Hutchinson confronted Preston. "Don't you know you can't fire on anybody without the order of a magistrate?" he asked. After talking with Preston, Hutchinson proceeded upstairs in the town house, where several members of the council had gathered. He assured council members that he would do his best to see justice done. Then the acting governor stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the scene of the massacre. He called for the crowd to be calm. "Let the law have its course. I will live and die by the law," he said. After midnight, the sheriff obtained a warrant for the arrest of Captain Preston. Preston was taken to the townhouse and interrogated by 2 justices. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the justices concluded that they had evidence sufficient to commit him. Preston was escorted to jail, where he remained for the next 7 months. It was a few hours later that Boston merchant James Forrest secured John Adams to represent the British captain and his soldiers. As Adams remembered the meeting, Forrest assured Now, under the ethical standards of today, Adams should clearly have made a choice between representing either Preston or the soldiers. Conflicts such as these, however, were viewed differently in the 1700s, and the soldiers' request for a joint trial was denied by the court without explanation. Captain Preston came to trial first. His trial ran for 6 days in October 1770 at Queen Street Courthouse. Adams chose to keep the trial focused on the events on King Street. Although his co-counsel argued for producing evidence of the earlier troubles between the citizens and the soldiers, Adams saw a danger in that strategy. Yes, the evidence might show a concerted plot by radicals to expel soldiers from the city of Boston. But, Adams suggested, the evidence concerning King Street events would be sufficient to acquit. Besides, he worried, opening up a political attack on the citizens' efforts to expel the British troops might spark a public reaction that would weaken his case. Even worse, Adams thought, if we stir this political pot, radicals might storm the jail. They might lynch Preston. They might terrorize jurors into voting for a conviction. The defense decided to keep its focus narrow. The central issue in Preston's trial was whether the captain gave the order to fire on civilians. Preston's steadfast denial was supported by 3 defense witnesses. 4 witnesses for the prosecution, however, swore that he gave the fatal order. The most convincing of the prosecution witnesses was Daniel Califf. He testified, "I was present at the firing. I heard one of the guns rattle. I turned about and looked and heard the officer, who stood on the right in a line with the soldiers, give the word to fire twice. I looked the officer in the face when he gave the word, and I saw his mouth. He had a red coat, a yellow jacket, and silver-laced hat, no trimming on his coat. I saw his face plain. The moon shone on it." Although the trial was transcribed in shorthand, no copy survives. We can, however, surmise the testimony of Captain Preston from the deposition he gave in advance of the trial. In it, he described the rising tension on the night of March 5. "I was between the soldiers and the mob, endeavoring all in my power to persuade them to retire peacefully." Preston offered this account of the actual shooting. "Some well-behaved persons asked me if the guns were charged. I replied yes. Then they asked me if I intended to order the men to fire, and I answered, no, by no means, observing to them that I was advanced before the muzzles of the men's pieces, and must fall a sacrifice if they fired. My giving the word fire under those circumstances would prove me to be no officer." While I was thus speaking, one of the soldiers, having received a severe blow with a stick, stepped a little on one side and instantly fired. Turning to and asking him why he fired without orders, I was struck by a club on my arm, which for some time deprived me of the use of it. On this, a general attack was made on the men, by a great number of heavy clubs and snowballs being thrown at them, by which all our lives were in imminent danger. Some persons at the same time from behind called out, "Damn your bloods, why don't you fire?" And instantly 3 or 4 of the soldiers fired, one after another, and directly after 3 more, in the same confusion and hurry. The 12-man jury was sequestered over the 6-day course of the trial. They survived on a diet of biscuits, cheese, cider, and liquor. When it came time to deliberate, they concluded that the testimony of Preston and the other defense witnesses was enough to raise a reasonable doubt as to whether Captain Preston ever gave the order to fire. They deliberated only a few hours before acquitting Preston on all charges. Given the loyalist leanings of one or more of the jurors, a conviction which required a unanimous verdict really never was a possibility. One juror reportedly confided before trial he would never convict Preston, quote, "if he sat to all eternity." The captain was, the juror said, as innocent as the child unborn. A transcript of the trial that followed, the trial of the 8 soldiers, survives. The case is formally called Rex versus Weems et al. The transcript gives us a much more complete picture of this trial compared to what we know about the trial of Captain Preston. In the soldiers' trial, several witnesses testified about how tensions built up in the few days before the massacre. Witnesses described the military-civilian confrontation at Gray's Rope Walk 3 days before the massacre, as well as other events that occurred on the night of March 5 near King Street. The prosecution's most damning testimony came from Samuel Hemingway. Hemingway told jurors about a conversation involving Private Matthew Kilroy. Kilroy was the soldier identified by another prosecution witness as the shooter of John Gray, one of the 5 men killed in the massacre. Hemingway testified that Kilroy said he would never miss an opportunity, when he had one, to fire on the inhabitants, and that he had wanted to have an opportunity ever since he landed. John Adams, however, presented testimony to support the theory that the soldiers fired in self-defense. One defense witness, James Bailey, testified that the soldiers were being pelted by large chunks of ice and other dangerous objects. He told jurors that he saw Crispus Attucks knock down Private Montgomery with a large cordwood stick. Adams asked the jury to put themselves in the soldiers' shoes. Would it have been a prudent resolution in them, or in anybody in their situation, to have stood still to see if the mob would knock their brains out? An especially compelling piece of defense evidence came in the form of a dying statement of Patrick Carr, one of the victims of the massacre. Carr died more than a week after being shot. He made a statement to his surgeon on his deathbed. The admission of this deathbed statement into evidence is the first recorded use of the dying declaration exception to the rule that generally excludes statements made by someone other than a witness to prove the truth of the matter asserted. These statements are what lawyers call hearsay evidence. The transcript reports the following exchange. Was you Patrick Carr's surgeon? I was. Was he apprehensive of his danger? He told me as a native of Ireland that he had frequently seen mobs and soldiers called upon to quell them. He had seen soldiers often fire on people in Ireland, but had never seen them bear half so much before they fired in his life. When had you had the last conversation with him? About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, preceding the night on which he died, and he then particularly said he forgave the man, whoever it was, that shot him. He was satisfied he had no malice, but fired to defend himself. After presenting over 40 witnesses, John Adams summed up for the defense. His eloquent speech blended law and politics. He told the jury this was a case of self-defense. He asked the jury to consider what any soldier would do under the confusing and life-threatening conditions. Do you expect that he should act like a stoic philosopher, lost in apathy? He concluded by arguing that the facts and the law supported the soldiers. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our past, country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been a foul stain on this country as the execution of the Quakers or the witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right. Yes, given the conflicting evidence the jurors heard, the verdict was exactly right. That is not to say, however, that the soldiers acted appropriately. When one reads the 96 depositions taken in the Preston trial, it is fairly obvious that before the massacre, many British soldiers acted as bullies and were looking for trouble. The soldiers ended up getting into more trouble than they bargained for. And then they reacted as one might expect in a life-threatening situation. Reaction to the Boston Massacre and the subsequent trials reflected the heated partisanship of the times. Samuel Adams continued to rail against the verdicts, complaining about the misuse of evidence and instructions overly favorable to the defense. Governor Hutchinson praised the verdicts and called Samuel Adams' criticisms sophistry. Samuel Adams fanned the flames of opposition to military occupation in Boston. He hoped the public outrage over the verdicts could lead to a speedy exit of British troops from his city. Trials decide the fate of defendants, but sometimes they also influence the fate of nations. After the trials, a sort of surface normalcy returned to Boston. But beneath the surface, in the hearts and minds of many citizens, resentment still ran deep. The revolution was coming.